My name is Sparky Bourne. I'm 92 years old. I've been here and done that. I've probably been here as long as anybody you've interviewed. I've seen the safety pin, the straight pin, the safety match, the cellophane, the celluloid, the cellophane, the tissue paper, the cardboard, the oilcloth. Lord have mercy, I've seen the television, the telephone, the cable, the steamboat, the cotton gin, the railroad, the automobile, the jet plane, the Lord have mercy, the rockets. I've seen the atom bomb, the hydrogen bomb, the nuclear bomb. What else is it? In my generation, I've probably seen more than any generation in the history of mankind. And it's almost impossible for any more things of consequence to occur in one generation. It just seems humanly impossible, really, for more things to occur than have happened in my generation. It's astounding to think back and realize that much has happened in my generation. As a young boy, I remember seeing 3 four-masted schooners at the dock in Georgetown loading lumber on at one time. Four-masted schooners. Most people have never seen a four-masted schooner. Those things didn't have an engine of any sort on them. They had to wait until the water was tip-top high, and then the captain was a remarkable individual in those days. He was a hero. He knew exactly when the ebb tide was and the water changed, and he'd tell the sailors, reef out the jib, and he'd pull the bow out into the stream. Then he'd tell the sailors when to reach out a tail sail and pull the stern out into the stream, and then he'd tell them when to pull out a mainsail, one of the main sheets, and get into the drift, and they'd start to maintain headway, and the ship would list over to the side, and he'd tell them pull out a big sheet, one of the mainsails, and list over a little further to the side, and get more wind in the sails, and to see that that ship start to drop more sheets and get more wind in the sails and lean further over the side and get in the channel and get underway was a beautiful sight. Most people would never experience that in their lifetime. My grandfather had a big plantation up at Sampit between Andrews and Georgetown, and he shipped a carload of lumber out of Georgetown one time in November, and it got in a belt of calms and drifted down into the Bahamas and stayed down there 10 months. And just before Christmas, 11 months later, it pulled into Boston, where it was supposed to deliver the lumber, and the price of lumber had increased 3 times. And he got 3 times the price of the lumber that he would have gotten had it gotten there on time. But in those days, every ship that left the harbor took a year's provisions of water and supplies. So they survived even though they were in a belt of calms for a solid year. So it was advantageous in one way, even though they didn't know that the ship was lost. They thought it was lost at sea. But it turned up 11 months later in Boston. So it was for the good of the good of all, really, that it was late arriving. My great-grandfather was captain of Marion's men of Winyaw, I know you've heard of Swamp Fox, Marion's man of Winyaw. I could tell you some interesting stories about that. He owned McDonald Plantation 4 miles out of Georgetown, and all the men had gone off to war, and the ladies sat on the porch most of the time with nothing to do. And my great-grandmother was sitting there one day, and a cavalry of Englishmen drove up and started watering their horses at the well. And she yelled out, "Don't tether those horses at that well." So the lieutenant said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Tether them down by the cow barn." She was a saucy old thing. And in a little bit, one of the soldiers came up to the steps and said, the captain said, he wants you to get us a hen for supper. So she called one of my aunts, Aunt Sugar, which was a spinster that never did marry. She said, "Sugar, go to the hen house and get a hen for those soldiers." So Aunt Sugar was gone for an interminable length of time. And she, sure enough, came back in a little bit, and Grandma Sally said, "What took you so long?" She said, "I was trying to catch one with the pip, a sick hen." And another time, another squadron of Yankee soldiers came by, and she yelled at them and said, "Don't tether those horses by that well." She said, "Take them down there by that barn." So sure enough, they obeyed her. They watered the horses and took them on down the barn. And Aunt Sugar was gathering eggs from nests that was stolen. Hens would steal nests and lay them out in the woods and the bushes. And Sugar was gathering eggs in an apron, and she heard the soldiers plotting a raid on Georgetown the following morning. And she came back and told my grandmother about it. And grandmother said, "Sugar, you go get on your pantaloons." She called some pants they had with elastic around it, and said, "You go through Polly Swamp, and you go to Sergeant Jasper's." Sergeant Jasper was Grandpa McDonald's, one of the sergeants in the Marion's men of Winyaw, and they had a camp down where McDonald Road School is today. And said, "You tell Sergeant Jasper what you heard those soldiers saying." He said they will go waylay the troops it's at White's Creek on the way to Georgetown at crack of dawn, and ambush them. So sure enough, when she told Sergeant Jasper, he said, "We'll waylay them in White Creek before dawn, and we'll ambush them." And sure enough, there's a plaque there today, so in memory of Sergeant Jasper's routing the British troops at White Creek before dawn and preventing the attack on Georgetown. The plaque is there today. But as Sugar went through Polly Swamp, it's about almost a mile from where McDonald Plantation, where I grew up as a boy, is, and where Sergeant McDonald had his squadron of men. And they waylaid the troops and routed them and killed a bunch of them and captured the rest of them. So that plaque is there today. And my father's brother married one of Grandma McDonald's daughters. So there was a double relationship between the McDonalds and the Bournes in that family. Uncle Manning was Daddy's brother, and he married one of Grandma McDonald's daughters. And when Uncle Manning went to war, he was a Mason, and he told Aunt Clara, he said, "I'm going to take this Masonic ring off, and I want you to wear it around your neck." And he said, "If you ever are in trouble and there's anybody around that's a Mason, you show your ring and he'll help you." And sure enough, every time the British would come by, they'd always look for silver and hidden treasures, and all the mattresses were feather beds in those days. And they'd run their spells through the pillows and the feather mattresses first thing they did when they went into a house. And they came in and started running their mattresses, their spells through those feather mattresses. And Aunt Clara followed them in the house, and she took that necklace and flashed that ring, and the lieutenant saw the ring, and he said, "Halt," told the men, "Halt." And he picked the ring up and looked at it and took his ring and crossed them like that and said, "Leave the house." And they didn't examine anything else in the house. That saved the ravish in the house. So that was a quail incident that happened right because of what Uncle Manning had told her to do. And another incident about the McDonald Plantation, there were 5 tenant houses, row houses we called them, down in what was called a company street, about a half a block down the lane from the house where all of the tenants lived. Mama Rose the cook and Jessie and Willie the plowboys. And Jessie was just 19. He was a young boy. He was my best friend. He taught me more about nature and everything than anybody else. And he told me one day, said, he called me Jess. James was my name. Jess, you want to go fishing with us? I said, yeah. He said, what time? I said, what time are you going? He said, 1 o'clock. Said, be down at the row at 1 o'clock. So I took my little fishing pole and went down there right after lunch. He said, what you bring that for? I said, you going fishing, aren't you? Yeah, we don't use those things. I said, don't use forces. We use holes. Use holes? Said, yeah, we fish with holes. I said, holes? He said, yeah. And sure enough, the women started coming out of the porches with garden hose like that. So I didn't say anything. I didn't want to appear too ignorant. So I followed them, and there were about 6 women, and Willie, the other plowboy, and Jessie, and we walked down the sandy road about 100 yards, and then they took to the woods, and the swamp wasn't about 200 feet, and they waded into the swamp, and I waded out right with them. I had on little short khaki pants and a T-shirt, and they all had a croaker sack tied around their waist, and they had, most of them smoking pipes, and they were singing spiritual songs, just singing and smoking those pipes, and they're all singing in unison. They all knew what they were singing, and I couldn't interpret the words, but they were singing just happy as a lark. And they waded out in that water about 18 inches deep, and they started hoeing like they're hoeing corn, just hoeing and singing. And I didn't have a hoe, but I was standing in the water listening to them, and all of a sudden, Liza was Mom Rose. She was the cook in our kitchen. She said, Liza, there's one behind you, there's one. And she picked it up. That's a warmouth. That's a warmouth. And she opened the croaker sack and put it in the croaker sack. And then I looked around. She says, Ada, there's one by you. And Ada was one that worked in the garden. She picked it up, says that's a red breast. And sure enough, there was a fish had a little red breast on it, and she put it in her croaker sack. And in a minute, there were little things yapping like that. Fish come up to get oxygen. The muddy was water, and they couldn't get oxygen, and there were fish yapping all over the swamp like that. And they started still chopping and working around picking up those fish. And in a little bit, Jessie said, "We got enough, ain't we?" And one or two of them said, "Yeah, I reckon so. We better start cleaning." So they came out of the swamp and they started dumping their sacks on the porch of those houses and started cleaning fish, and was still singing up a storm. And they cleaned fish, and they gave me half a dozen fish, and I went on home with the fish. One of them said, "This is nigger fishing." I wouldn't have said that. One of them said, "This is nigger fishing." Of course, I wouldn't have said that. My daddy's father used to own most of the land from 4 miles this side of Andrews all the way to the Santee River. There were 5 plantations on that tract of land. He was filthy rich, and the boys had Sunday boats. But when the war came on, they all went to service except one uncle. He had an eye impairment, and he started investing their money in DuPont gunpowder. DuPont nitroglycerin. And he made all of them rich while they were in service. But DuPont invented black powder, and the market fell just like that. And it broke every one of them overnight. Daddy used to tell about going to New York to buy the latest Paris fashions. It's a big store at Sampit. And the ladies from Georgetown would catch the train and ride up to Sampit, and the Surrey would meet them at Sampit. And that house had 7 bedrooms in it. And the ladies would spend the weekend and do their shopping and go back to town on the train Monday morning. And one of the ladies told me, he fell in love with Daddy, said, "You never know how close I came to being your father." That was Miss Lena Thomas.
And your mother.
And Daddy would tell me about when they'd go, Mad Bourne would always go to the opera, and Daddy would tell me about those ladies sitting on 4 inches of the seat with those little opera glasses looking at the stage. He said, sometimes I'd crawl around under the seat and see if I could find pieces of candy or he said one day when they were 12-year-old boys, they took the buggy apart and put it up on that upstairs, reassembled it on that upstairs porch, and said, Bourne got so mad with him, he whipped him with the buggy whip. He caught him swinging in the swing, and he wrapped the buggy whip around him and caught him. He said when they learned to smoke, he said they went in the hay barn, and they caught the hay barn on fire and burned the hay barn down. He said Pat Bourne made them do all kind of chores. He said they had a barn, a big store, and he said they sold everything there to caskets. The 3rd floor was lined with caskets. Even sold, made caskets and sold caskets. And when somebody would die, they'd always take them up there and let them look for caskets. And he said in the wintertime, the blacks would come around and sit on a long bench they had on the sunny side of the store, and said the blacks would go to sleep. And Daddy said they sold everything in big barrels back then, grits, and rice, and molasses, and potatoes and things. And he said he'd go tear off a little piece of brown paper and make a funnel out of it and dip it in the molasses barrel and come and drain molasses in those blacks' mouth while they were snoring, and the flies would fill their mouths. Said those blacks would never wake up, just snore and suck the flies in, and the flies would crawl back up. Daddy said when he became a teenager, they always had to pay off in cash. And he said, this 12-point bail had come in, and they sent him to town one day to get the payroll. And he said he went to the Planters and Merchants Bank and got the payroll, and he said he had to wait for the bank to open up. And he said, I think I'll try that bail. And he said he was daring, a daring young man then. He said he got a can of it and said, it tastes so good, I think I'll get me another can for that bank. And said that back then it was 12-point bail. It said it'd knock your hat off. And said 2 of them got him tight as a tick. And see, he went to the bank and gave him a list for a check and for the amount of money, and said it was all in coins, and it said it was a 10-pound sugar sack of coins, and said he got on a horse and started riding back to Sampit, and said he was feeling good as could be. Said when he got to Sampit, the sack was empty. There wasn't a dime in the sack. Said they had to send back to town to get more payroll money. when I was overseas, the first night I was overseas, air raid alert sounded, and it was cold over there, and they gave you 1 pound of coal. We stayed in little Quonset huts, 1 pound of coal per man, and it never heated the little places. And all we had was 2 GI blankets, and we slept in our long handle underwear. And the time the siren sounded, we always stayed up and listened to Midge, the propaganda girl. She'd always tell us about how the boys back home would date our girlfriends and our wives, you know, and try to disillusion us. But when that air raid alert sounded, we hauled-tailed out of that little hut and went to the little air raid shelter, which was nothing but 1 row of brick, zigzag like that, no roof over it. And we were the only ones standing out there. We were freezing our behinds off. And we looked at each other, and nobody was out there but us. And those big old searchlights were up there trying to bracket that German plane that was trying to bomb us. And we looked, well, how crazy we are standing out there freezing and nobody else is out there. So we hauled-tailed back inside and covered up, and that's the only time we went back out. But every night we were over there, the Germans would send a harassing plane over and either strafe the base or harass us. And Midge would tell us about it every night. She said, "Don't you boys see and think we've forgotten you. We'll be back over tomorrow." And she'd tell us that. And they had a propaganda minister in England that would tell us what time. One time she told us the clock in the mess hall was 20 minutes slow, and it damn sure was. It was 20 minutes slow. And she'd tell us where we were going to bomb the next morning. And sure enough, we went to Hamburg the next day. And she told us we were going to bomb Hamburg. It was ridiculous. They knew more about what we were going to do than we did ourselves. So we laughed. Lord Haw-Haw came on right behind Midge, and he briefed the British. He briefed the British and told the British how we were dating their girlfriends, and try to demoralize them, which we were. But we wouldn't go to bed till Midge got off the radio. We listened to her every darn night of the world, and she'd always end up by singing Lily Marlene, my own Lily Marlene. We just stayed up to her sing that. She was educated in Los Angeles. She graduated from the University of UCLA, and she was well educated. I don't know how she ended up over there, broadcasting propaganda to the Yanks every night. It was, we wouldn't go to bed till she got off the radio. I flew a raid one day, and she told me where we were going. And sure enough, we went to Hamburg, and that day I was flying along, and all of a sudden everything got reddish purple, and my cheeks got, only where the oxygen mask was, got hot as could be, and the plane, it almost jerked the yoke out of my hand, and I couldn't see for a minute, and the plane was up, and then it came back down, and when I got where I could see, nothing but the wheel of the airplane, it blew up in my face. Nothing but the wheel was showing. And I looked around, and there were 27 parachutes going down around me. And the waist gunners were counting the parachutes. And they were, on that raid, it was a big Hamburg raid. There were 1,000 planes, and 400 of them didn't get back. 400 of them. When we got back to the base, only had 3 planes, three engines landed on. We crash landed. We had 238 holes in that plane. The waist gunner got a finger blown off, and the ball turret gunner got hit in the foot. And that's the only 2 people on the plane got hit with 238 holes in that plane. It was remarkable. Here I am sitting talking to you like nothing happened. My wing commander was Jimmy Stewart. I flew several raids with Jimmy Stewart. And that rascal could sit down and play the piano just like he knew what he was doing. But we never talked about the movies. I don't ever remember the movies being mentioned. One day Martha and I walking around in one Sunday afternoon. We were in Norwich, England. That's north of my base, and we were looking for a place to eat. The places didn't open up until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they put the menus on the store windows, what the fare was going to be for that evening, and Martha was walking down one side of the street, and I was walking down the other, and I looked at this little narrow entrance, and I said, "Martha, this looks interesting." I was reading the menu, and I saw a little light on in the vestibule, and I motioned her over that side, and she came over, and I said, "This door, there's a light on in here. Let's go in this little vestibule," and we did, and there was some little steps going downstairs, so we went downstairs, and there was nothing but a little stone room. A room was twice this size, and it was nothing but stone, and beautiful little room, and little tables, and a little bar over here, and behind the bar there was an opening, and I hooped, and nobody answered. I said, "Well, let's just sit down." I said, "The light's on," so we sat down. In a minute, the maitre d' came in, and he sat down, and I said, "Is the place open?" He said, "Yes, it's open. Can I help you?" I said, "Well, we'd like to order." And I said, "What you serving today?" And we got to talking, and he said, "Well, the chef will be here presently." He said, one of your chaps used to eat here regularly." I said, "Who was that?" He said, "Major Stewart." Well, he wasn't a colonel then. He said, "Major Stewart." I said, "Well, that's my wing commander." He said, "He is?" He said, "Yeah." He said he used to come in here and play the piano and sing. He said, "Well," I said, I've flown several raids with Jimmy." And he said, "Well, he was a regular attendant of ours. He'd come in and sing and play the piano." I said, "Where is that at entrance school?" He said, "Well, that's interesting." Said, "The old Archbishop, the cathedral was right at the end of the street. Beautiful, beautiful cathedral. I mean, it was a palatial place, like St. Peter's Cathedral in London." And he said the old Archbishop didn't like for the ladies to walk the streets on Sundays and let the chaps gap at them. He said, "Gap at them." He said the Archbishop had a underground street made into the cathedral. He said, "That leads from here into the cathedral." I said, "The hell you say?" He said, "Yes, it does. It leads into the cathedral." He said that you ought to go in the cathedral. He said it took 500 years to build. He said it was burned twice by the Slovaks. He said, and you can see the different type stone that is constructed in the palaces when you go in there. And sure enough, we went in the cathedral, and he said some of them came from Italy and some of them from Milan, and you could see the different grain in the stones as they were stacked in those palaces in the cathedral. It was most interesting. And they had several chapels in there, different chapels in the little cathedral. So we enjoyed that very much. We had a nice meal in the little cafe. My radio operator and I met these little. When we got overseas, the British had been on rations for 5 years, and they were little tow-headed children. They hadn't had decent clothes in 5 years, and one day we'd take them in the mess hall and give them fruits and chocolates and a square meal every now and then. And on this particular day, my friend Lindstrom, who was my radio operator, and I took these two little girls under our wing for that day, and we made little paper windmills. We introduced them to chewing gum. They didn't know what chewing gum was, and their parents chastised us about that later. But anyway, we stayed with them all day long, and they never forgot us. Every time there was a Yank that came over to see a little ahead of my story, we restored our control tower and made it into a 4th Air Force museum. And the lady that lived next door became custodians and carried the key to it. And when we opened it, we had a ceremony, and each one of us were given a key. And she would take tourists through the museum, or any one of the 8th Air Force who visited over there, she'd take them through the museum to see the memorabilia and what have you. And Daphne and Ann and Daphne would try to go by there and ask every member that came if they knew Johnny and Sparky. So one day, Martha and I were at the lady next door talking to her, and this bicycle came up with these 2 nice pies in the basket. And she stopped and pointed a finger in my face and called my name. And it was Ann, one of these girls that we had taken that day. And she pointed her finger and called my name. Well, we had gone over for a bomber group reunion, and Martha and I were standing in this girl who was custodian of the museum little yard right next door to the control tower. And she said, "I'm going and call Daphne right now." And Daphne said, "Could we see you tonight?" I said, "Yeah." So we went by Daphne's house that night, and we stayed up till 1 o'clock that morning, having a few shooters and talking about old times. And we have stayed in touch ever since. I invited them over one time and took them to Disneyland, and I rented a condo right in Disneyland. And we stayed down there a week. Didn't even have to use the car. The shuttle bus would come by, pick us up in the morning, and take us into Disneyland, and we'd go every day to Disneyland. And later on, I invited them over to, we have a beach house at Paulus Island, and they wouldn't leave. They'd go down to the Riviera for vacation on that black sandy beach, volcanic sand. They'd never seen a white beach like Paulus Island. They wouldn't leave that beach. I'd go to town to run my 2 businesses, and they'd fill that cooler in the morning after breakfast and with drinks, and they'd go over on that sandy beach, and they wouldn't leave the beach except to come back for a noon meal and go right back on that sandy beach all day. They never had seen white sand like that before. And they stayed over 2 weeks on Paulus Island with us. They'd never seen anything like that before. But we stay in touch right now. Lynette emails letters to Daphne right now. And their son, their 16-year-old son, got killed by a lorry. A kid got in the truck, not knowing what he was doing, and backed and pinned him up against the wall and killed him. And everything is in his room just like it was. He was musically inclined. Nothing's touched. His guitar's right on the bed. Everything, Daphne says, is still on the bed just like it was the day he died. After the war, I didn't go back to school. I started 2 businesses. I started a roofing company and a heating and air conditioning company, and I operated both of them for 41 years. Jeep Ford, Clayman Grimes.
Eddie Carraway.
Bud Black. When I went in service, there were 44 Jewish families in Georgetown. Now there's 1 Jewish lady, Martha's bridge partner, and her daughter living in Georgetown. That's the only Jewish people living in the city of Georgetown. You know, there's one thing about the Jewish people that I don't understand. facing towards sunrise. Well, if you go to the Jewish cemetery, most of the graves are facing towards the sunrise, but right adjacent or parallel to the Duke Street, there's a 10-foot strip there where the graves are perpendicular to the street. And nobody can tell me why. Jessie told me if we ever get lost in the woods, said look for the thickest bark on the tree, and that'll be north. And said it's a tendency to walk around in circles if you get lost, so always break twigs on trees and you'll know you're not walking around in circles. He said, usually cows will graze in the woods. He says, follow the cows home. And I did that one time. I followed my neighbor's cows home. He lived 2 miles up the road, and I followed his cows home. Then I knew where I was, and I went home. Jessie taught me a lot. He said, we went rabbit hunting one day, and he said, now, rabbits always stay in thickets. We jumped a rabbit. He said, the rabbit will always come back to the thicket. So, sure enough, we jumped a rabbit. He said, let's stop right here. I said, why? He said, the rabbit will come right back here. Well, there was a tree falling down, leaning across the thicket. He said, let's stop right on this log. So sure enough, we stopped on that log and we're standing up there, and in about 15 minutes, that rabbit started hopping down. He said, you see me on? And I put my little .22 rifle on that rabbit, and this is the truth. And I followed that rabbit, and as it went by, I ping, and I shot that rabbit right in the head just before he went on that lap and killed him. Of course, Jessie told me he was coming. When I went into cadets, I took pilot training at the Methodist. You know where the Methodist home in Orangeburg is? Well, that was the pilot training flight school. That was Hawthorne School of Aviation. My class was the last class to graduate from Hawthorne School of Aviation. They turned it over to the French pilots after that. I was the last class to graduate from there. After the war, the Methodists bought it from Hawthorne School of Aviation and turned it into a nursing home. Well, those oak trees weren't planted then. The French pilots planted those oak trees there, those big live oak trees, after they left there as a memorial to the U.S. government. So every one of those big oak trees were planted by the French pilots. Now, Christmas, I was in training there during Christmas. We didn't get any leave during Christmas, but I went to the squadron commander and told him that I had not been able to get Christmas leave the previous year because I was in transit. And I only lived 90 miles from home, and I would ask him if he'd give me special privilege to go home overnight to spend Christmas with my parents because my father was sick. And he granted it. He said, but you'll be back 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. And I said, yes, sir. So after open post that afternoon, 5 o'clock, I caught the bus into Orangeburg. Well, when I got there, he told me there were no further buses into Charleston. I was going to catch the bus to Charleston, and I knew there were always buses to Georgetown. So when I got on the bus in Orangeburg, the fog rolled in so thick, it took us 4 hours to get to Charleston. And when I got to Charleston, there were no further buses to Georgetown. Well, I was stymied. I thought right quick, well, I'll run around to the post office. I'll see if I can catch the mail delivery man to Georgetown. Well, when I went around to the back of the post office, the mailman said, "What are you doing around here? Public is not supposed to be around here." And I reached in my pocket and I pulled out a $10 bill, and I handed it to him. I said, "I'd like a ride back." I had on my uniform, and he said, "Well, go stand over by that light post. I'll be through here in a few minutes, in about a half hour," he said. So I darted across to that lamp post, and I leaned up by the lamp post, and St. Michael's Church right across that's the four corners of law. The post office, the courthouse, the St. Michael's Church, and something else anyway. And I looked at that, the lights on in St. Michael's Church, and I said, "You know, I've never been in that church. I think I'll go look inside of St. Michael's Church." So I went over to St. Michael's, and the main door was locked. Well, they got two side doors on the front, on the same street. So I went to the right-hand front door, and it was open. So I opened the door, and there's some stairs leading up to the mezzanine. So I walked right up the stairs, and the minute I put my hands on the mezzanine rail and looking down in the auditorium, the lights went off. I was in total darkness, and the only thing that I could orient myself with was that little tinted glass over the altar, and it wasn't any light shining. It just illuminated, you know. And I felt myself down that rail, and felt myself back down to the floor, and felt down the wall, and got to the main door, and it was a swinging door. And I pushed it open and thought I was on level ground, but there was a differential in the floor. And my foot went down, and I went rolling up to about the length of that television to the main door. And I got to the main door, and it was locked solid. I couldn't open the door. So it was dark as the inside of a black man's pocket. And I didn't know what in the world to do. So I went to the door. I had come in, and it was locked tight. I came back in and feeling my way down the wall and back down the same wall, and I meant to miss that swinging door that time, and went on to the side by the other door and pushed it open, and there was a window on that what's the name of the street? I can't recall the name of the street now, but there was a window there. So I tried to raise that window, and it hadn't been open since the Revolutionary War. I strained and strained and strained. Finally, I backed up to it, and with all my strength I could muster, I got it open so my fingers would go under it. And I bucked and strained and strained. I got it open so the palm of my hands would get under it. And then I got it open. I strained, and perspiration came out on my brow. And I finally got it open so I could get my head under it. And as soon as I got my head under it, a Navy officer and his wife or date started coming down the street. I ducked in, and my cap fell off on the sidewalk. Lord have mercy. I said, I'm caught. I'm caught. I'm caught. They could see my cap, but as it happened, they must have been tight, because when they got closer, they were singing. And I realized they must have been tight. And Hibernian Hall, half a block down the hall, was just singing away. They were having a midnight party. And I figured they were going to Hibernian Hall. So when they got past the corner, I strained again, and I strained, and I strained, and I could get my shoulders out, and I got my shoulders out, and I fell on that sidewalk and put my garrison cap on, and I ran across to that post, and I leaned up on that post, and headlights came out of and I fell in that car, and I delivered newspapers from Charleston to Georgetown, and I got home 7 o'clock that morning, just in time to sit down at the breakfast table. And time we got through eating, it was time to leave to go back to Orangeburg. But let me tell you, coming home, coming home, Ethel, we after I finished my raids, I was waiting to come home, and the weather was too bad to fly. I was going to fly the plane back home, and we were going to fly back home. It probably somebody fly a plane with a bunch of us on it, and they had the Yalta Conference, and Churchill and Roosevelt met Stalin, and General Patton was stalled down. They stopped him down south of Paris, south of Berlin, and wouldn't let him come on charge and capture Berlin. Churchill and Roosevelt let Stalin talk them into letting him come into Paris, into Berlin. And James F. Burns was Secretary of State at that time. And James F. Burns tried to talk him out of letting Stalin hoodoo him. But Stalin knew that East Berlin was the hub. They controlled the communications, the sanitation, the supplies, the defense. Everything was controlled as a hub. The rail system, everything was controlled from East Berlin. And James F. Burns knew that. He tried to talk Roosevelt and Stalin out of that. That's why he wrote that book, All in One Lifetime. He came right home and resigned. He couldn't stomach it. And he wrote that book, All in One Lifetime. Every American should study that in history. But it's not taught in history. But he wrote that book. And Stalin built the Berlin Wall, and he wouldn't cooperate with the Allies at all. That's why everything that came into Berlin had to come through the Berlin airlift. I had a cousin that flew the Berlin airlift. He told me about flying the Berlin airlift, and the Yaks flying right along beside him, grinning at him. That's preposterous. But anyway, I volunteered and flew General Patton a load of supplies and dropped them to him out of the camera hatch of that B-24 bomber. And one day, C-47 landed at the base, and it had a note, Crew 77, many thanks for your assistance. Had a load of vintage cognac and champagne, and everything on the base got tight for 3 days, even the mascot monkey. And everything shut down. And when my house at Paulus Island was destroyed by the storm, that note from General Patton was in among the things, and a letter from President Roosevelt that I had gotten when I traded stamps with him as a boy, and a letter from Tom Yawkey thanking me for sprinkling Tom Yawkey's ashes over South Island Plantation for me. Things that I couldn't replace. I wouldn't have given anything, but they all went with the storm when my house went with the storm. But things I couldn't replace. But that's just the way the cookie crumbles sometimes. Oh yeah, he was a good friend of mine. I visited him in Boston when I had my son up in Boston. I visited his office in Boston. And one time Mickey was in Annapolis, my son, and he didn't get any time off to plebe year. In that June, they got a week off, and he and his roommate Tim wanted to see the Yankee Red Sox series. And I called Jean, and I told her that he and Tim were up there, and they wanted so bad to see the Yankee, and I wondered if she could get them tickets. And she said, tell them to go by the Yawkey Street entrance and pick up 2 tickets. And they were her private box. And Mickey said, hey, I've always been in the peanut gallery, and I could tap the players on the head. Oh yeah, one day I was down there, I had my crew down there putting a roof on a boathouse for him, and he came by the boathouse and said, Sparky, get in here. He had a Jeep, and he had on old canvas back pants and a plaid shirt, and I got in the Jeep with him, and we rode down the beach road all the way to Sandy Bank, and he reached he blew the horn, and he reached under the seat and picked out an old chicken, and this big old 14-foot alligator come lumbering out of the creek up on the bank, and he threw the old chicken out to the alligator. He was feeding the alligator. He didn't ever stay in the big house with Jean. He had a double-wide trailer he stayed in. She stayed in the big house with her companion. He started a goose pond down there, Lake Gaddis Goose Pond, and I used to fly over there every now and then and count the geese for him and tell him how they increased. He planted corn in it down there, and he had a nice flock of geese down there. Well, I did him a big favor when I was on the board of county commissioners. I got him. The county never put a patrol over there to keep the roads. He kept the roads and all up over there, and the chairman of the board didn't want to give him permission to control the roads, to keep down night hunters and all. And I brought it up before the board numerous times to give him his exclusive rights to control the roads and let his superintendent have a game warden's commission. And I got it approved, and Mr. Yawkey appreciated that, and that's why we really became close friends. I went out. I had my own plane, and I went out to the air base to fly one day, and I saw Mr. Yawkey sitting on a bucket one day, and I walked over. I said, "What you doing out here, Mr. Yawkey?" He said, "Sparky, I'm going up to Boston one more time to let those doctors play with me." He had cancer. He knew he was dying, and he never came back. A couple of friends and I started a building project in Fort Walton Beach, Florida, and I'd leave here in the morning, 6 o'clock, and I'd fly out to Fort Walton Beach, Florida, and inspect the site and sign checks and leave Fort Walton Beach and fly back to Georgetown and work in the afternoon that same day. Sometimes I'd fly my buddy to Orlando and then come on back to Georgetown, but one night we were going to buy some supplies up in Birmingham, and we left after dark and took off from Crestview, Florida, which is a little grass field just north of Fort Walton, and we would go shop the next morning in Birmingham, buy some hardware supplies, locks and hinges and things like that the next morning, and fly on back to Crestview, and then I was coming on back to Georgetown, and I was going to fly my buddy on to Orlando and then come on back to Georgetown, and I filed a flight, came on back, put my buddy out at Fort Walton, and I was going to fly across the Gulf to Orlando, and I filed a flight plan with the Funiac Springs, and I got out in the Gulf, and I saw a front moving in, and they hadn't briefed me on the weather, any front, and I called the Funiac Springs and asked them for a change in heading, and they said, "Why?" I said, there's a front moving in off the Gulf, and they said, "We don't have any briefing about weather." I said, "I want a change in heading," and about that time I heard Mayday, Mayday, and I got my change in heading, and I got a more northerly heading, and about that time I heard a second Mayday, and I told them I want to change it, called them to Funiac Springs and told them I want to change in altitude. That front was moving in fast, and I got a change in altitude, and I called the Funiac Springs and called for another change in altitude, and I got down I was at 5,000 feet. I got down 2 more thousand feet, and pretty soon that thing had me down to 1,500 feet. And I went on and landed at Orlando, and when I got to the base, I found out that first Mayday had crashed, and killed both the pilot and the student pilot. And the next Mayday, it crashed and killed the student pilot. And where I filed my flight plan to Phoenix Springs, Florida, they had never had any warning of weather off the Gulf. We moved off the plantation. My mother, let's see, I used to go down the dock and listen to the old sailors talk and play jackknife. They had, all of them had yellow rags tied around their neck, and they'd open their knives and they'd play jackknife. And they'd play for poppy seed, which was opium. I didn't know it then. They'd play for poppy seed, little white seeds on the wharf, and they were playing for, I didn't know it, they were playing for opium, and I didn't know what in the world it was. And the captain sometimes would send me uptown for plugs of tobacco and things like that. I'd run errands for him, and he'd take me on the ship sometime. When we first went to England, we'd go to, my buddy and I'd go to these pubs and start drinking beer when the pubs would open at 2 o'clock in the evening. And one afternoon we were sitting in a pub drinking, and this distinguished gentleman, his name was Basil Whitchurch. I've never forgotten it. We asked him to come over to our table and have a drink with us. And he was well educated and most distinguished, one of the most polished English gentlemen you'd ever want to meet. And he was telling us about how they survived during the war. Said everybody had a victory garden. Every Englishman was involved in some way. They even had a victory garden, or everybody was engaged in some sort of industrial work. He had a lathe in his basement, and he made parts for the RAF. He was making parts for carburetors in Lancaster bombers, and one day during the week, the truck would come by and pick up his part and another part from his neighbor and on down the street, and they'd take them to an assembly plant, and they'd assemble them and put them on planes. And another lady down the street was making bandages for wounded parts, and another person was making escape kits for pilots. They put in plastic boxes to wear in there, like we had in our flying suits. We had escape kits. You had, in that escape kit, you had Atabrine tablets, you had water purification tablets, you had a needle and thread, you had a little tiny compass, you had a stick of chewing gum, and you had a chocolate square, concentrated chocolate square, and a silk map of Europe, all in that escape kit. And he smoked Prince Albert tobacco. And he said, I haven't had a can of Prince Albert tobacco in 4 years. So when I came home, I sent him a 5-pound can of Prince Albert tobacco. But he said, just a minute, I'll be with you chaps in a minute. He left and he went in the back, in the basement, and he came back with a black bottle, had dust on it. It looked white, it was full of dust. And he cleaned that thing off. He said, this is a bottle of 1820 wine. He said, I've been saving this for a special occasion. And he opened that wine, and his wife and Linda and I sat there and drank that bottle of wine. He said, if this is not a special occasion, I've never experienced one. But he was a grand old gentleman, I'll tell you that right now. But another time we were drinking, I had a date with a little English girl called Hazel Apple. I had met her in a pub before, and I had made a date with her for that afternoon, and she manned a barrage balloon in Hyde Park. And Lindy, I left Lindy drinking at the pub, and it wasn't a half a block. The cable winch was mounted in Hyde Park, and the cables floated all over London at different altitudes to keep the German planes from strafing London. And I was standing there. We'd write on a piece of paper and send a message up the cable, you know, and we were just waiting for her shift to relieve her, and then she'd come to the pub and we'd start drinking some mild and bitters or stouts, and sure enough, after a while, her shift came and relieved, and we went into the pub and started drinking. And her father was an air raid warden, and he knew exactly where she was. And the bombs started falling, and all of a sudden, the floor started getting wet. And somebody said, "This floor is getting wet." And the girls started getting concerned, and somebody went and tried to get the door open, and the door was jammed. And somebody went to the back door and said, "This door is hot." And the back door was hot. Well, the girls started screaming, and we got concerned then, and we realized we were trapped. We couldn't get out. So we all got kind of concerned, and we all started bucking against the door, and we realized the door opened to the inside. And we realized then we were trapped sure enough, and we tried wrecking on the front door, and we couldn't get it open. And all of a sudden, the back door opened, and water just flooded in. Well, we saw her daddy. He was an air raid warden, and he knew where she was, and he had gotten somebody and broken in that back door, and we all got out. But had her father not been an air raid warden, and we might have burned up in that building. So that was an experience that, and another time, now this is really hair-raising. Lindy and I, we got drunk. We managed to get a hotel room, which was most unusual in the Lexus Hotel in London Northeast, and we were drunk as hoot owls. And after the pubs closed, we went to the hotel and went to bed, and I don't know how many buzz bombs hit that city, but the buzz bombs were hitting it, and all of a sudden, we were on the backside of the building, the hotel, and the window didn't break. And we pulled a GI blanket up over our heads, and I heard Linda says, "Well, if this hits, I want to die in bed." I remember that. And by that time, we went to sleep or passed out. But the next thing we knew, we got up in the morning and splashed some water in our face, and had a little lavatory in there. The room had been divided with a sheetrock partition, made 2 rooms out of 1, and we staggered downstairs. We still hung over, and opened that door and looked across the street. There was a hole half a block deep across the street, and gantries were lined up. There's 25 gantries lined up on that street. Somebody said they were American wax. There were 25 dead American wax lined up on that street that had been killed that night in that hotel. And us sleeping through the whole thing, we felt like fools, but we didn't. We slept through the whole thing. One time, I'll tell you another story about the Salvation Army. One time, Lindy and I talked these 2 girls into staying, and we said, "If you all stay and drink with us till the pub's closed, we'll walk you home. We'll get you home." So they agreed. And we stayed there till all of us got tight, and we caught the tube, and they lived. We didn't have any idea where they lived. We didn't ask them, but they lived the last stop on the tube, London West, and we got off the stub, didn't know where the hell we were, and they said we live up the street, and they lived about 8 or 10 blocks up the street. In a rooming house, must have been 400 or 500 secretaries and stenographers all lived in the same boarding house. And when we knocked on that door, some old biddy, he looked at us like we'd kidnapped him or something. And she grabbed those girls and jerked them in that room and slapped that door in our face. And we didn't know whether to turn which way to go. It was dark as the inside of a black man's pocket. We didn't know where we were, which way to go. And I looked at Lindy, and he looked at me, and I said, which way? He said, this way. I said, you don't know which way any more than I do. So we went back the way we had come, and I said, well, I know we head that way. So we did. We started walking. And we walked. Well, I know we walked 2 hours. I said, we lost us inside of a black man's pocket, Lindy. He said, well, let's keep going. I said, but what else can we do? We kept walking. We kept walking. We walked another hour or two. Finally, I saw a little tiny cross, just about this pencil size, under a canopy, just like that. Just a red under a canopy. I went and I looked at that little thing. I said, should we go in? He said, should we go? I said, hell yes. It's the only door we've come to. I opened that door, and there was blankets from one end to the other, men laying in their sleep. From one end to the other, it was 50 feet long, nothing but blankets and men laying on the floor. Somebody came to the door and said, come on in, we'll make room for you. It was the Salvation Army.